Beneath the flawless smile and the flawless dress, my new daughter-in-law called me, "This is the family embarrassment we're stuck with." Right there, in front of 200 guests. But when her father turned toward me, his face drained of color, and his voice trembled with something that sounded a lot like disbelief. If you're listening, don't forget to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far stories like this can travel. The sound of laughter, crystal glasses, and chamber music drifted through the ballroom, the kind of soft, expensive noise only old money knows how to make. The Wells estate stood like a marble crown on 50 acres of Connecticut perfection. White roses climbed the stone archways, and the scent of champagne mixed with gardenia hung in the warm evening air. Then a single sharp sound cut through it all, the shatter of glass. My champagne flute slipped from my hand and exploded against the marble floor. Time seemed to hold its breath. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward me, the woman in the simple navy blue dress standing beside the glittering new bride in Vera Wang and diamonds. Cassandra Wells didn't flinch. Her posture was perfect, her lipstick untouched, her voice as smooth as the music that had just died behind her. "Mom, Dad," she said brightly, "this is Evelyn Hart, the family embarrassment we're stuck with." The words hung in the air like perfume, beautiful, poisonous, impossible to ignore. The 12-piece orchestra stumbled into silence. Forks clinked once, then stopped. I could feel the heat of 200 stares pressing against my skin, every one of them trying to decide whether I would laugh, cry, or simply vanish. I didn't move. A waiter froze mid-step, the silver tray trembling in his hands. Somewhere in the corner, someone drew in a sharp breath and swallowed it hard. The last violin note still quivered in the air, as if waiting to see whether I would shatter along with the glass. Across the room, Victor Wells, Cassandra's father, froze with his champagne halfway to his lips. The color drained from his face, his jaw slackened. Then, with a voice that barely scraped past his throat, he whispered, "Evelyn Hart? Wait, you're the woman from the acquisition meeting, the one who bought Mitchell Holdings." The murmur that followed was instant and electric. Mitchell Holdings. The name raced through the ballroom like fire through dry grass. Cassandra's smile cracked, confusion flickering behind her carefully trained expression. Her mother, Elaine Wells, went rigid, her manicured fingers clutching the pearls at her collarbone, the way people do when they suddenly realize they might be prey instead of predator. And me? I said nothing. Years in boardrooms had taught me that silence, when used well, can be more devastating than words. Let me explain. My name is Evelyn Hart, and for most of my life, I've been very good at being invisible, not out of fear, but by design. It's an art form, really, knowing how to disappear in plain sight, how to be exactly what people expect to see, nothing more, nothing less. For 15 years, I lived that way. A quiet widow in a modest apartment, living comfortably on my late husband's pension and a life insurance policy. That was the story everyone believed, and I made sure it stayed that way. Because beneath that quiet exterior, I was building something most people couldn't imagine. People think power is loud. They think it belongs to whoever raises their voice or commands the room. But real power, the kind that lasts, is quiet. Sometimes I think Andrew knew that better than anyone. He used to tell me, "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard, Evie." I could still see his hand pushing the laptop toward me on those late nights. "Run the risk models again," he'd say with that half smile. Precise silence always beats noisy confidence. Back in 2012, my husband Andrew Hart and I were engineers in Silicon Valley, two middle-aged dreamers surrounded by caffeine, deadlines, and men convinced they were the smartest in every room. Andrew spent years developing a power management system, software so efficient it could double smartphone battery life. When the patent finally sold, we expected to make enough to retire comfortably. We never expected a $22 million deal. We celebrated that night with cheap champagne and takeout noodles, laughing about what we'd do once life slowed down, though neither of us really believed in slowing down. Andrew wanted security, I wanted legacy, so we split the difference. He handled safety, blue-chip stocks, conservative bonds, while I chased opportunity. I studied markets, startups, risk. We stayed up till 3 a.m., took courses, called analysts, lost sleep. By 2015, that $22 million had tripled. By 2018, it had multiplied again. When Andrew died in 2020, I buried the man I loved and inherited a portfolio worth roughly $800 million, quietly distributed through shell companies, real estate trusts, and private holdings. No headlines, no interviews, no trace of my name. 2 years later, I used a fraction of that fortune to buy a struggling conglomerate called Mitchell Holdings, the same company Victor Wells had nearly bankrupted through reckless expansion and ego. He thought the buyout came from a faceless corporate investor. He had no idea that the investor was me. Under competent management, the company thrived. I attended exactly one meeting, the acquisition signing, and let the lawyers handle the details. Victor never looked twice at me. To him, I was just another polished wife sitting in for moral support. If he'd looked up, he might have noticed the way I studied the numbers or the calm satisfaction of a woman quietly taking control. But he didn't, and I preferred it that way. Until that wedding night. Now here we were in his mansion, under his chandeliers, surrounded by his peers, and for the first time, he finally saw me. The shock on his face was almost poetic. The woman his daughter had mocked for wearing department store pearls and driving a reliable sedan was the same woman who owned the company that had saved his fortune. I could have corrected Cassandra right there, could have reminded her that not all power sparkles under candlelight, that sometimes the richest woman in the room is the one everyone overlooks. But I didn't. I simply smiled. A small, private smile that never reached my eyes. I didn't need to speak. The truth was already telling the story through Victor Wells's trembling hands and his pale, disbelieving stare. People think power is loud. They think it belongs to whoever raises their voice or commands the room. But real power, the kind that lasts, is quiet. It's the ability to stand perfectly still while the entire room rearranges itself around you. That night, as whispers spread and Cassandra's flawless smile began to crack, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. After 15 years of deliberate invisibility, I was finally visible again. And from that moment on, there was no going back. Morning light spilled through the kitchen window, thin and cold against the marble countertop. I had been awake for hours, replaying every word from the night before. Cassandra's voice, Victor's stare, the silence that swallowed the ballroom whole. I hadn't slept. Power can make you feel invincible for a moment, but when the music fades and you're alone with your thoughts, it leaves you exposed in ways you don't expect. The phone rang just after 7. I didn't need to look to know it was my son. Levi never called that early unless something was wrong. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, too formal for morning. "I just got off the phone with Victor Wells. He asked me some strange questions. About Dad's patents. About your investments. He said your name came up in a conversation last night. What's going on?" For a second, I just listened to the sound of his voice. The same voice that used to beg for one more bedtime story when he was 6. The same voice that called me from college when he thought he'd failed a course. But this tone was new, suspicious, hurt. "I think Victor may have had too much to drink," I said, stirring my coffee, though it was already cold. "He probably got confused." Levi exhaled sharply. "No, Mom. He was very clear. He said he recognized you. He said you'd been involved in the acquisition of his company. I didn't even know you knew what his company was called." His words landed like stones on glass, small, precise, and cracking something I'd tried to keep whole for 15 years. I forced a calm tone. "People say things at weddings, honey. They remember faces wrong, they exaggerate. You know how that is. But Levi wasn't convinced. He didn't seem confused. He said, "You sat in that meeting 3 years ago, that you were the investor. Tell me that's not true." I wanted to. I wanted to give him the simple version, the comforting lie that would let him go back to believing his life was untouched by the kind of wealth and power I'd quietly built. But lies have a way of multiplying, and I was running out of places to hide mine. Before I could answer, another sound broke the tension, the soft chime of a message on my phone. It was from Cassandra. "Let's have lunch today. We have things to discuss." No greeting. No emoji. Just that. Levi must have heard the silence on my end. "What is it?" "Nothing," I said quickly, glancing at the screen. "Just your wife, Cassandra." His tone sharpened. "What does she want to talk about?" "I'm not sure," I lied, though the truth was already taking shape in my mind. Cassandra Wells didn't do small talk, and she certainly didn't do surprises. If she wanted lunch, it wasn't about reconciliation or courtesy. It was a strategy. Levi sighed. "Mom, I know you don't like her, but please, don't make this worse. She's just trying to understand what's happening." I looked out the window, watching a neighbor walk her dog, watching life move on like nothing had changed. "Levi," I said softly, "do you trust her?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course I do," he said, though his voice wavered at the end. "That's good," I replied, forcing warmth into my tone, "because in marriage, trust is everything." I hung up before he could hear the tremor in my voice. The kitchen was silent again, except for the slow tick of the clock on the wall. The same clock Andrew and I had bought for our first house. I traced my finger around the rim of my coffee mug, thinking about how easily the life I'd built could come undone, not by scandal or crime, but by a woman who smiled like she was offering peace and planned like she was waging war. Cassandra Wells was many things, intelligent, charming, beautiful, but what she really was, deep down, was curious. And curiosity in the wrong hands is dangerous. As I stood there in the quiet morning light, I realized something unsettling. The hardest part of keeping secrets isn't hiding them. It's pretending they don't exist once someone starts looking. And I had the distinct feeling Cassandra Wells had just begun to look. The restaurant Cassandra chose wasn't the kind of place people went for food. It was the kind of place people went to be seen. Crystal chandeliers, imported marble, and a maitre d' who addressed everyone as sir or madam, whether they'd earned the title or not. It was noon on a Sunday, and the air smelled faintly of truffle oil and self-importance. She was already there when Levi and I arrived, seated at a corner table with a clear view of the entire dining room. Of course she was. Power for Cassandra Wells was about vantage points, about control. She stood up when she saw us, that practiced smile spreading across her perfect face. "Evelyn, Levi," she said warmly, as though nothing had happened at the wedding. "I'm so glad you could make it. I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of Bordeaux. I think it's the same one we had at the reception." I glanced at the label. A $2,000 vintage. The gesture wasn't generous. It was positioning. "Lovely choice," I said, taking my seat across from her, though perhaps a little extravagant for a casual family lunch. Cassandra's eyes sparkled. "Oh, I don't think anything about our family is casual anymore." Levi gave an awkward laugh, unsure whether to relax or brace himself. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap and waited. I'd learned long ago that with certain kinds of people, patience was the most effective weapon. The waiter poured the wine. Cassandra lifted her glass but didn't drink. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, elbows just grazing the tablecloth, her tone light but deliberate. "You know," she began, "I was talking to Daddy last night after the reception. He told me some fascinating things about corporate acquisitions, especially about how some investors prefer to stay anonymous." Levi looked up, his brow furrowing. Cassandra continued before either of us could respond. "It's interesting, isn't it? the use of shell companies, silent partners, discretionary trusts, all those clever ways people keep their names off the paperwork. I studied finance at Wharton, you know. Of course she wanted me to know that. Everything Cassandra said was a chess move, each word placed to corner her opponent without appearing to attack. That's very commendable, I said smoothly. It's important to understand how money moves, especially when it moves quietly. For a moment, our eyes met, and I could see the flicker of satisfaction behind her calm expression. She thought she had me pinned. I read about the acquisition of Mitchell Holdings this morning, she said. Such an incredible story. $800 million, if I remember correctly. The article even had a picture. She reached into her designer handbag and produced her phone. A single image glowed on the screen, a grainy news photo from 3 years ago. At a long table sat a group of executives, lawyers, and bankers. And there, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a woman in a navy blue dress, her face half turned away from the camera. "This woman," Cassandra said, turning the screen toward us. "Her posture, her hair, even the way she holds her purse. Doesn't she look familiar?" Levi leaned forward, his expression tightening. "Mom." I studied the photo for a moment, then met Cassandra's gaze. "The quality isn't great," I said evenly. "Hard to tell much of anything." She smiled, a slow, triumphant smile that didn't belong to someone asking a question, but to someone confirming a suspicion. "Isn't it funny," she said lightly, "how coincidences seem to happen right when people least expect them?" "Indeed," I replied, taking a measured sip of wine, "though I've found most coincidences are just patterns we don't yet understand." Cassandra tilted her head, pretending to ponder that. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe they're the universe's way of showing us who people really are." Levi's hand tightened around his glass. "Cassandra," he said quietly, "what are you getting at?" "Oh, sweetheart," she said, resting a manicured hand on his. "I'm just curious. Daddy mentioned that when Mitchell Holdings was acquired, the buyer was incredibly discreet. He said the woman at the meeting seemed elegant, composed, and surprisingly familiar." The words hung there, deliberate and heavy. I set my glass down gently. "It sounds like your father remembers that day vividly. I'm glad the company's success left an impression." Cassandra didn't blink. "He also said the buyer disappeared completely afterward. No public records, no interviews, nothing. Almost as if she wanted to remain invisible." I smiled faintly. "Privacy isn't a crime." "No," she agreed, her tone still sweet. "But secrets usually come with a reason." For a moment, silence wrapped around the table. Levi looked from her to me, confusion clouding his face as realization began to take shape. I could see it, the question forming behind his eyes, the one he was too afraid to ask. I reached for my water glass, my voice steady. "Cassandra, dear," I said gently, "you're far too smart to chase coincidences. But if you enjoy puzzles, I hope you're ready for what happens when you actually solve one." Her smile froze, just for a second. Across the table, Levi's eyes met mine, searching, uncertain. I saw the corner of his mouth tighten, the way it used to when he was 8 and terrified of being called to the front of the class. For a heartbeat, the man sitting there disappeared, and all I saw was my little boy waiting for me to say, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're fine." Cassandra thought she was drawing me out, but all she'd done was show her hand, and I just decided to let her keep playing. By Monday morning, the wedding felt like a lifetime ago. The headlines were back to politics and stock markets, but in my world, the silence after a scandal is rarely peaceful. It's camouflage. I'd spent the entire night replaying Cassandra's voice in my head, every calculated phrase from that lunch. Anonymous investors, shell companies, $800 million. When people like Cassandra start asking questions, they don't stop until they've torn the wrapping off everything. And I'd built my life out of very carefully wrapped boxes. The next morning, I found myself standing in the quiet lobby of Blake & Associates, my financial advisory firm. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive paper, frosted glass walls, soft gray carpet, the kind of understated design that told you discretion was their real product. Martin Blake had been my advisor for nearly a decade. He was a man in his late 50s, tidy gray hair, reading glasses that lived halfway down his nose, and a mind as sharp as a scalpel. When I walked into his office, he was already standing, a file in his hand. "Mrs. Hart," he said with a polite nod. "You look like a woman who hasn't slept." "I haven't," I admitted, taking the seat across from his desk. "I need you to tell me how much trouble I'm in." Martin closed the door before answering. "That depends," he said carefully. "Trouble from whom?" "Cassandra Wells," I replied, "and by extension, her father." That got his attention. He sat down, opened the file, and flipped through a few pages. "I was wondering when you'd mention them. I've been reviewing some movements in your account since Friday, so routine cross-checks. But then your daughter-in-law's name came up in an entirely different context." I leaned forward. "What kind of context?" He adjusted his glasses, the way he always did when the news wasn't good. "Research inquiries," he said. "Private investigator-level research. Someone's been asking about anonymous investors connected to the Mitchell Holdings acquisition. Specifically, tracing shell companies and beneficial ownership structures. The timing lines up almost exactly with your son's wedding. So Cassandra hadn't wasted any time. How far have they gotten?" "Not far," Martin said. "Your legal protections are solid. But it's not just idle curiosity. The investigator they hired isn't cheap. Whoever's funding this wants results. I already knew who that was. Cassandra." He nodded slowly. "That would be my guess. And she's not doing it out of paranoia, Mrs. Hart. She's doing it out of entitlement." That word hung in the air like smoke. Martin leaned back. "You see, she grew up believing Mitchell Holdings would one day be hers. Victor had been grooming her for it since she was in graduate school. Then you came along and bought the company outright. It was a business move for you, but for her, it was personal. You didn't just buy a corporation, you erased her inheritance." I looked down at my hands, the faint reflection of the city skyline glimmering in the glass tabletop. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "I doubt it would have changed anything," he replied. "But she sees you as the woman who took away her legacy, and now she's married to your son. I think she considers that her second chance to reclaim it." That thought landed like a slow, deliberate weight in my chest. "So this isn't about the company," I said. "It's about control." Martin nodded. "Control and perception. If she can prove you've been hiding assets, she could claim you've manipulated your son's financial status. That could hurt his career. You've kept Levi's life clean, separate from your fortune, but public opinion doesn't care about boundaries. Once people smell money, they assume corruption." The idea made my stomach twist. "He's worked hard for everything he has. He doesn't even know what I'm worth." "Which is why this could backfire," Martin said. "If she digs up enough to make noise, even if it's all legal, it won't matter. The optics alone could damage both of you." He slid another document across the desk. "You asked me to look into the Wells family's finances a while back, just as a precaution. I updated it this morning." I scanned the first page and felt my pulse slow to something colder than fear. The Wells estate was mortgaged to nearly 80% of its current value. Their investment accounts had been steadily drained for years, supporting a lifestyle that cost more than it earned. Victor's retirement consulting income came mostly from a single client, Mitchell Holdings, meaning indirectly, me. "They've been living off credit," I said. "Credit and pride," Martin confirmed. "When people like Victor run out of liquidity, they start trading reputation instead. Cassandra's smart enough to realize her family is one misstep away from collapse. That's what makes her dangerous. She has nothing to lose and everything to prove." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing against my spine. "So what do you suggest?" He hesitated. "Get ahead of it. If this becomes a public fight, you'll lose control of the narrative. Decide what you're willing to reveal and what you're not. And Mrs. Hart," he paused, meeting my eyes, "if you thought this was just a family dispute, it's not anymore. This is strategic." I looked out the window at the gray city skyline, cars crawling like ants far below. 15 years of building a fortress around my privacy, and one ambitious woman with a phone could bring it all down. Martin's voice softened. "If it helps, your defenses are strong. It'll take her time to find the cracks." "She won't stop," I said quietly. "Not until she finds something." "Then make sure what she finds," he replied, "is exactly what you want her to see." As I left his office, the afternoon light cut sharp through the glass corridor, slicing everything into reflections. One version of me walking forward, another walking away. For the first time in years, I felt the faint, thrilling pulse of an old instinct I thought I'd buried with Andrew. If Cassandra Wells wanted to play this game, she'd just given me permission to start moving my own pieces. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the city beyond my windows, the kind of muted sound that makes even expensive neighborhoods feel lonely. I stood by the cabinet where Andrew used to keep his favorite wines. For years, I'd told myself I was saving the last bottle for something special. Tonight felt close enough. I pulled the cork from a dusty bottle of Bordeaux we'd bought in Paris 15 years ago and poured a single glass. The first sip was sharp, almost bitter, but it steadied me. Then I turned toward the dining table, now covered in the past 15 years of my life. Folders stacked in neat columns, bank statements, investment reports, share certificates, the quiet architecture of a fortune that no one was ever supposed to see. I'd built this empire piece by piece, from the day Andrew sold his patent, through every merger, every risk, every sleepless night. And now, because one ambitious girl couldn't stand not knowing, it was all being dragged into the light. I started with the basics, tracing the recent digital activity Martin had flagged that morning. Cassandra's curiosity hadn't just been idle gossip, it was a full-scale operation. Within minutes, the patterns emerged. Multiple searches linked to Ashford Private Investigations, a firm known for its discretion and its price tag. Their clients didn't hire them to find missing dogs or lost jewelry. They hired them to follow money. I scrolled further through the records, cross-checking with financial registries Martin had provided. There it was, an encrypted invoice from Ashford issued 3 weeks ago. The payment came from an account under C. Wells Holdings, one of Cassandra's side corporations from her Wharton days, still active but dormant until recently. The invoice line read, "Corporate Asset Tracing, Primary Target, Anonymous Investor, Mitchell Holdings Acquisition, 2021. For a long moment, I just stared at the words, the red light of my desk lamp casting everything in a strange, theatrical glow. The air in the apartment felt heavier, as if even the walls were listening. She really had done it. The young woman who'd smiled through the wedding, who'd called me the family embarrassment, had been investigating me before she ever walked down the aisle. I kept reading. 2 days after the Ashford payment, another appeared. Smaller, but from a different vendor. Harrison and Webb Associates. My pulse slowed as I recognized the name. A law firm specializing in family wealth disputes and trust challenges. Cassandra wasn't just digging for information, she was preparing for war. And that wasn't all. A third file showed a credit application in her name. 3 new personal loans, all approved within the last month. The total wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to fund an investigation and keep appearances intact. She'd borrowed against her future, betting that uncovering mine would make her rich. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization sink in. My wine glass caught the light, a deep red halo against the paper chaos spread across the table. 15 years of precision, of secrecy, of planning every move so no one, not Levi, not the IRS, not a single investor, could trace the empire back to me. And now, all of it was vulnerable, not because of oversight or greed, but because a clever, desperate woman had decided that mystery was just another problem to solve. I thought about Andrew then, how proud he'd been of our restraint, how he'd said, "Real strength doesn't need to be seen." He'd been right, but real strength also needs to know when to strike. My fingers brushed over the paper trails, the ledgers, the contracts I'd signed in rooms full of men who underestimated me. Every file on this table was a chapter of how I'd survived them, and now another woman thought she could turn that story into her victory. I closed the folder and stared at my reflection in the window. The city lights shimmered like distant fires, and for the first time in years, I felt the old thrill return. The quiet pulse of strategy, the steady rhythm of a mind calculating its next move. "She's playing a game," I said softly, almost to myself. Then I took another sip of wine and smiled. A small, deliberate smile that held no warmth at all. "If she's playing a game," I whispered, my voice low and steady, "she has no idea who she's playing against." The next evening, I set the table the way I always did when company came over. Simple plates, linen napkins, a modest cheese board, and a bottle of wine that looked expensive but wasn't. Presentation has always been one of my quiet strengths. When the doorbell rang, the clock on the wall read exactly 7. Punctuality. Another sign that Cassandra Wells didn't do anything by accident. She walked in first, followed closely by Levi. Her posture was immaculate, her smile perfectly calibrated, the expression of a woman who believed she was about to win. Levi looked tense, his tie slightly askew, eyes flickering between us like a man caught between two storms. "Mom," he said, his tone careful, "thanks for having us. We just thought it'd be good to clear the air." "Of course," I said smoothly. "Sit down. Would anyone like a glass of wine?" "I think we'll need it," Cassandra replied, setting her leather portfolio on the coffee table. She wore a dark suit today, not the kind you wear to impress, but the kind you wear to negotiate. Once the glasses were poured, she opened her folder and slid a series of printed documents toward me. "Evelyn," she began with a serene smile, "I want to start by saying that everything we discuss tonight stays within the family. We're all on the same side here." I tilted my head slightly. "Of course. Please go on." She took a deep breath, the kind people take right before they start a presentation. "After the unexpected revelations at the wedding," she said delicately, "I spent some time thinking about how to best align our interests. The truth is, this family has significant resources, and it's time we started managing them strategically." "Strategically," I repeated, letting the word roll between us. "Yes," she said brightly. "That's why I've drafted a proposal for something I call the Hart Family Foundation. It would serve both philanthropic and financial purposes: charity, public image, generational planning." Levi shifted in his seat. "She's been working on this all week," he said quietly. "It's actually really thorough," Cassandra continued undeterred. "The foundation would launch with an initial endowment of $50 to $60 million. It's large enough to establish credibility, but small enough to remain flexible. We'd all serve as trustees, equal voting rights, equal decision-making power." I took a sip of wine. "Equal power," I said softly. "That sounds fair." "Exactly," she said, her smile widening. "This would protect the family's legacy while maintaining transparency. I've even spoken with an attorney about structuring it efficiently for taxes and liability." Of course she had. "Tell me, Cassandra," I said after a pause, "what kind of attorney did you consult?" Her confidence wavered for just a moment. "A family wealth specialist. It's perfectly standard." "Oh, I'm sure it is," I replied evenly. "Would that specialist happen to be Harrison and Webb Associates?" The color drained from her face before she could stop it. "I see you've done your homework," I said, setting my glass down gently. "So have I." Levi frowned. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I reached for the folder I'd prepared, thinner than hers, but infinitely heavier. "I think it's time we stop pretending this is a family meeting and start calling it what it really is." Cassandra straightened. "And what's that?" "An audit," I said calmly. "Yours." I opened the folder and began laying out the documents one by one. "This," I said, sliding the first sheet across the table, "is an invoice from Ashford Private Investigations. It was issued 3 weeks ago, paid by C. Wells Holdings. The scope of work reads, Corporate Asset Tracing, Primary Target, Anonymous Investor, Mitchell Holdings Acquisition." Levi's brow furrowed. "Cassandra, what?" She reached for the paper, but I placed another document on top of it. "And this," I continued, "is a legal retainer from Harrison and Webb, the same firm you mentioned. Their specialty? Family wealth disputes. You hired them 2 weeks before the wedding." "That's not what it looks like," she said quickly, her voice cracking slightly. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like," I said. "You weren't planning a marriage, Cassandra. You were planning an acquisition." Levi looked stunned. "Is that true?" She turned to him, her mask faltering. "Levi, I was just trying to protect our future. Your mother, she's been hiding things. I needed to understand what we were marrying into." "Marrying into," I echoed, my tone cutting through the air. That's an interesting phrase for a woman who claims to love my son. So I asked the question directly. "Do you love my son, Cassandra? Or did you just see him as a door you could pry open?" Cassandra froze. Her smile was still there, but her pupils tightened, the way they do when someone steps into sudden light. The first thing that cracked wasn't her voice. It was her right shoulder, dropping 1/2 inch, the smallest tell of a person falling out of the story they built for themselves. "That's not fair," she whispered. The room went still. Levi's eyes flickered toward her, desperate for something real. But Cassandra only hesitated, just long enough for him to see the truth. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Neither is deception," I said. I placed the next set of papers on the table. "These are your recent loan applications. 3 new credit accounts opened in the past month. You borrowed against your future to fund your investigation into mine." Levi's voice was barely audible. "Oh, God." "And finally," I said, producing the last folder, "a summary of your parents' finances. The Wells estate is mortgaged at 80%. The investments are nearly gone. Victor's consulting income, the one thing keeping your family afloat, comes from Mitchell Holdings, which I own." Cassandra stared at the documents as if the words themselves could undo her. "You thought you were marrying up," I said quietly. "But the truth is, your father's comfort depends on my continued goodwill." She looked from me to Levi, her voice trembling now. "You're twisting this." "No," I interrupted. "I'm clarifying it." I took out one final item, a small recording device. I thought this might help with context. I pressed play. Cassandra's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "I'm done dating men who can't provide stability. This time, I'm choosing someone with potential, someone from a family that actually has a future." Levi flinched as if the words had struck him. Cassandra went pale. "That was taken out of context," she stammered. "It was a conversation from years ago. 3 weeks before you met my son," I said flatly. "With your college roommate." She kept the message. Levi stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Cassandra, please tell me this isn't who you are." Her eyes filled with panic. "Levi, listen to me." "No," he said sharply. "All this time, I thought you were trying to build a life with me. You were just building a case." She reached for him, but he stepped back. "You used me," he said. "You used all of us." Cassandra's composure collapsed completely then. Her voice rose frantic. "You think she's some saint?" She's been manipulating everything. Your job, your future, she owns your life. I stayed seated, calm as glass. Levi earned everything he has. I stayed out of his career because I wanted him to have something that was truly his. But now you've made that impossible. Mom, he said quietly, what do we even do now? I met his eyes. We stopped pretending that greed and love are the same thing. Then I turned back to Cassandra. You wanted transparency, dear? Here it is. She sat down slowly, her breath uneven, her hands shaking. I gathered the papers into a neat pile and slid them toward her. You tried to audit me, I said softly. You should have audited yourself. The room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Levi stood in the doorway looking at the woman he'd married but clearly no longer recognized. Cassandra stared at the evidence on the table, the perfect smile that once charmed rooms now gone completely. I poured the last of the wine into my glass, letting the silence stretch until it became something almost tangible. Get some rest, both of you, I said finally. You're going to need it. And with that, I closed the folder and the door on whatever illusion of family we'd been pretending to have. 2 weeks can feel like a lifetime when everything you've built starts to unravel. The newspapers hadn't mentioned our names, but whispers traveled faster than headlines. Within days, I began receiving calls from old colleagues, polite inquiries wrapped in curiosity, people asking if everything was all right. That's how you know someone's been talking. And then, one Friday morning, Martin Blake called. His voice was tight, the kind of tone that only means one thing: bad news. Evelyn, he said, we have a situation. What kind of situation? Regulatory, he said carefully. Someone's filed a formal complaint with the SEC, allegations of insider trading, beneficial ownership concealment, and failure to disclose controlling interests. I didn't have to ask who. Cassandra Wells, I said. Yes, Martin confirmed. Her name appears nowhere on the document, but the language is hers. She's been coached, and whoever helped her knows just enough to make things complicated. I looked out my window at the skyline, pale and glassy in the winter sun. How bad is it? Bad enough to draw attention, he said. Even if you're completely clean, and I know you are, the investigation itself will make noise. If this escalates, it could pull Levi into it. People will question his career, his position, his promotions. They'll assume everything he's earned was handed to him. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd spent 15 years building an empire that no one could see. Now, one vindictive woman was turning it into a weapon against my son. Do you want me to handle it quietly? Martin asked. No, I said after a moment. Let her think she's winning. That night, Levi came over unannounced. The knock on the door was sharp, angry. When I opened it, he was standing there with red eyes and clenched fists. She filed for legal separation, he said flatly. Her lawyer says she's worried about undisclosed financial liabilities within the family. That's what they're calling it now, liabilities. I'm sorry, I said softly. No, you're not. His voice cracked. You wanted this. You've been waiting for her to fail, and now she has. Are you happy? It wasn't the accusation that hurt. It was the grief behind it. Levi looked like a man trying to find a version of reality that still made sense. Levi, I said quietly, I didn't want your marriage to end. But Cassandra was never building a life with you. She was building a case. She loved me, he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Maybe she made mistakes, but... Levi, I interrupted gently, do you really think love comes with subpoenas? That stopped him. He sank into a chair, pressing his palms to his eyes. She's trying to destroy you, Mom. Do you even realize what she's done? I do, I said. She's filed complaints with federal regulators, hoping to force me into a settlement. It's blackmail dressed up as due diligence. He looked up, confused. A settlement. She wants leverage, I explained. If she can't control my money through you, she'll try to control my name through scandal. She thinks I'll trade silence for peace. Levi let out a low, bitter laugh. And will you? I met his gaze. You know me better than that. He studied me for a long time, the anger in his eyes softening into something closer to exhaustion. You've always been 2 steps ahead of everyone, he said quietly. But this time, she's coming for you publicly. I know, I replied. That's why she'll lose. Cassandra's strong, but she doesn't understand the kind of power that survives scrutiny. She's fighting for attention. I'm fighting for precision. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You make it sound like a chess match. It is, I said. She moved her queen too early. The room fell silent. Outside, the city lights flickered against the dark glass. For a moment, I could almost see Andrew in the reflection. Calm, patient. The way he used to look when we solved problems together. Levi rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know what to believe anymore. Part of me thinks you're right. The other part just misses my wife. I walked to the sideboard and poured him a drink. Then grieve for her, I said gently. But don't let grief blind you to the truth. Cassandra isn't done yet. She'll use every weapon she has, emotion, reputation, fear. And when she runs out, she'll start inventing more. He took the glass, his voice low. What do you need me to do? I looked at him. My son, the boy who'd once built toy circuits beside his father, now sitting across from me, ready to face the storm. Stand still, I said softly. Let her come closer. The closer she gets, the easier it is to watch her undo herself. Levi nodded slowly, the first flicker of resolve crossing his face. For the first time in weeks, I saw something I hadn't seen in him since childhood. Focus. Okay, he said. Then we do it your way. I smiled faintly, reaching for my glass. Our way, I corrected. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, between the hum of the city and the ticking of the old clock, the line between mother and son blurred into something stronger. Not just family, an alliance. The next morning, a red-sealed envelope sat on my kitchen table like an unblinking eye. I wasn't afraid of what was inside. I was afraid of how they'd choose to tell the story. Paper is neutral. Stories never are. Martin Blake's conference room was a study in quiet intimidation. Mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of city view that made people forget who actually owned the building. It was 9 a.m., sharp when the elevator doors opened, and the people who had spent the past month tearing each other apart stepped into the same room. Cassandra Wells entered first, her lawyer in tow. Stephen Rowe, a smooth, well-tailored man whose reputation for family wealth litigation preceded him. Behind them came Victor and Elaine Wells, both trying and failing to look composed. Levi arrived last, his expression unreadable, followed by me. Martin greeted everyone with the restrained politeness of someone who'd seen too many dynasties implode over brunch. Thank you for coming, he said. Let's try to keep this civil. Cassandra smiled sweetly as she took her seat across from me. Of course, she said. I think we all just want what's fair. Fair. A word that had never meant the same thing to anyone sitting at that table. Stephen Rowe opened his briefcase and began distributing folders. My client, he said smoothly, believes that in light of recent events, it would be prudent to formalize certain financial structures to protect the long-term stability of the Hart and Wells families. In other words, I said evenly, you want my money. He smiled without flinching. We're proposing the creation of a family trust, Mrs. Hart. A transparent entity in which family assets can be managed collectively, ensuring that all parties have appropriate oversight. Victor cleared his throat. It's not about taking anything from you, he said, his voice rehearsed. It's about structure, legacy. You've done well for yourself, Evelyn. Surely you understand the importance of planning for the future. Elaine added, we just want to make sure Levi and Cassandra's children someday are protected. Levi's eyes flicked toward me, full of silent disbelief. He hadn't been warned about this. Cassandra, meanwhile, leaned forward, every inch the polished strategist. "We all benefit from transparency," she said softly. "A family trust means no more secrets, equal governance, equal accountability." I studied her for a long moment. The flawless posture, the unblinking eyes, the confidence of someone who still believed she was the smartest person in the room. "Equal," I repeated. "You do like that word." "I like balance," she replied. "Balance," I said slowly. "Interesting word to use when you're sitting on a pile of family debt and hoping someone else doesn't tip the scales." Her composure flickered. "Excuse me." I opened my folder, not to the legal documents, but to the financial report Martin had prepared weeks earlier. "Victor, Elaine," I said, sliding it across the table, "your estate is mortgaged at 80%. Your investment accounts are nearly depleted. The only consistent income in your household comes from consulting fees paid by Mitchell Holdings, the company I own, which means, in a very literal sense, I already fund your lifestyle." Victor went pale. Elaine reached for his hand. Cassandra's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. I looked back to her lawyer. "So you'll forgive me if I don't rush to place my assets under shared management." Stephen Rowe cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hart, I understand this is personal." "Everything is personal when someone tries to steal your name," I interrupted. "And make no mistake, that's exactly what this is. You can call it a trust. I call it a takeover." Martin shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He knew better than to intervene. Cassandra's voice softened, the way people do when they're about to lie. "No one's trying to steal anything, Evelyn, but secrets have consequences. The regulators are already asking questions. This is an opportunity to make things right before it all becomes messy." There it was, the leverage, the threat wrapped in diplomacy. I leaned forward. "Let me make something clear. I don't owe you explanations. I don't owe you money, and I certainly don't owe you control." Cassandra's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Then maybe it's time someone else decides what you owe." Levi slammed his hand against the table. "Enough," he snapped. "Cassandra, what the hell are you doing?" She turned to him, voice trembling with practiced sincerity. "I'm protecting us. You think this is about money? It's about survival. Your mother has been hiding assets that could bring down everything if the government decides to dig deeper. I'm trying to save what's left of our family by dismantling it." He shot back. "By filing complaints, hiring lawyers, and dragging everyone into this circus." Stephen intervened smoothly. "My client has acted in good faith, Mr. Hart. Her only concern, I cut in, is that she backed herself into a corner and now wants me to pay for the walls." Silence followed. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC system, steady as a heartbeat. The room had gone still, the kind of silence that hums right before something breaks. I turned the fountain pen between my fingers, a gift from Andrew years ago. "Some signatures open doors," I said quietly, my voice even, "and some close the wrong ones for good." Then I looked straight at Cassandra. "Choose your door." Then I stood. "Since we're being transparent," I said calmly, "allow me to propose my own offer." Cassandra blinked, clearly thrown. "Your offer?" "Yes." I looked around the table, meeting each gaze in turn. "You withdraw every complaint filed with the SEC, every investigation, every legal petition, within 72 hours. In return, I'll give you $5 million. The room froze. Victor's mouth opened. Elaine gasped softly. Stephen's pen slipped against his notepad. Only Cassandra didn't react, not immediately. She just stared at me, eyes narrowing, trying to gauge if I was bluffing. $5 million, I repeated. One payment. No conditions except one. You sign an agreement never to contact me or my son again. Ever. Levi turned toward me, his face pale. Mom, you can't. I can, I said. And I just did. Cassandra finally found her voice. "You're offering to buy me out of my marriage." I met her gaze without blinking. "No, I'm offering to free my son from one." The words landed like a gavel. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Cassandra laughed, short and credulous. "You think you can just pay me to disappear?" "I think," I said, "that you care more about money than pride. And I'm willing to test that theory." Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering something urgent. Victor shifted uncomfortably, his hand gripping the armrest. Elaine's eyes darted between us, terrified of the silence that filled the room. Levi's voice broke through, raw and trembling. "Cassandra," he said quietly, "just tell me the truth. Did you marry me for love or for money?" Cassandra's smile faltered. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked unsure. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, she opened her mouth, but nothing came out. And that silence was all the answer anyone needed. I turned to Stephen Rowe. "You have until noon tomorrow," I said. "After that, the offer expires, and so does any goodwill I have left." Then I gathered my folder, placed it neatly into my bag, and nodded to Martin. "Thank you for the room." Levi followed me out, but not before glancing back at Cassandra. Still seated, her perfect composure collapsing around the edges. For the first time, she looked small. The next morning at 11:47 a.m., Martin's assistant called. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "Stephen Rowe has confirmed acceptance of your offer. The transfer will be completed by 5 o'clock. I thanked her and hung up. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Cars, sirens, sunlight on glass. The world didn't care about the price of peace. But I did. $5 million. A clean ending. Cassandra Wells would disappear as completely as she'd entered our lives, in a dress, a smile, and a storm she never learned how to control. By the time summer came, the storm had passed. Cassandra Wells accepted the $5 million settlement and disappeared as efficiently as she had entered our lives. No public statements, no interviews, not even a whisper in the circles she once fought to belong to. It was as if she had never existed. Just another ghost in the long history of people who mistook wealth for power. Levi filed for divorce a week later. The paperwork was clinical, the silence between signatures even more so. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no late-night calls begging for another chance. Just two people quietly acknowledging that whatever had bound them together had never really been love, just ambition wearing a white dress. For the first time in months, my apartment felt still again. The old clock ticked softly, steady and reassuring, like a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. I spent my mornings reading in the sunroom, my afternoons walking the same park trails Andrew and I once loved. The world had stopped feeling dangerous. It was just quiet. 6 months later, on a Sunday evening, Levi called. His voice sounded lighter than I remembered. "Mom," he said, "I met someone." Her name was Rachel Moore, a teacher at a local community school. He told me she loved old movies, brewed terrible coffee, and thought wealth was something that had nothing to do with money. When I told her my mother lived in a modest apartment and drove a reliable car, he said with a laugh, she told me that sounded perfect. I smiled, feeling something inside me ease, a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. "Then she sounds like someone worth keeping," I said. That night, as the city lights shimmered through my window, I realized I'd come full circle. 15 years of hiding, building, and protecting, all so I could remember what truly mattered. I finally understood it. People think power is applause, the noise, the spotlight, the standing ovation. It isn't. Power is when the room quietly rearranges itself while you haven't moved an inch. When silence answers louder than outrage. That's the kind that lasts. There's a difference between being invisible and being private. Invisibility is fear. Privacy is freedom. And for the first time in a very long time, I was free. If you've been listening, thank you for staying through this story. Don't forget to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. And if you have a story of your own, maybe it's time the world heard it too. I'll see you in the next story.